Say the word out loud. Jedi. Now say this one. Jedi. Your mouth barely moves. One is the guardian you grew up with. The robe, the glowing blade, the calm voice telling you the dark side leads only to ruin. The other is something older and stranger, and almost nobody remembers it existed. But here's the thing this whole story turns on. The second word came first. And when it split apart, it didn't split into good and evil. It split into two, and both halves were the same. We've been told a simple story for 40 years. There is the light side, there's the dark side. Jedi serve one, Sith serve the other, and the entire history of the galaxy is a war between them. Order against chaos, selflessness against hunger, good against bad. It's clean. It's the first thing anyone learns about Star Wars. And it is, at its root, a translation error that hardened into scripture. Because before there was a Jedi Order, before the word Sith meant anything at all, there was a single order of Force users on a planet in the deep core called Tython. In the Legends comics Dawn of the Jedi, written by John Ostrander and drawn by Jan Duursema starting in 2012, we finally got to see them. They called themselves the Jedi, and the name came from an old monastic language, Dai Bendu. It meant mystic center, not warriors of light, not soldiers against darkness, the center, the balance point, the still place between two forces that were never meant to be enemies. And that's the part your instincts will fight, so let me be precise. To the Jedi, the light side and the dark side were not morality, they were not virtue and sin. They were closer to two seasons, or two tides, or the image the Jedi themselves used, two moons hanging in the same night sky, one bright, one dark, both real, both necessary. You didn't defeat one of them any more than you defeat winter. You lived in balance with both, or you didn't live well at all. And notice how radical that is. Everything the later Jedi would preach, that the dark side is a poison, that a single angry thought puts you on a path you can't come back from, that Anakin's fall was written the moment he loved too hard. None of it existed here. The Jedi would have found it baffling. To them, refusing the dark side entirely was itself a kind of imbalance, a sickness, something the planet they lived on would punish you for. And I mean punish in the most literal sense, which is where we're going next. So how did we get from there to here? How does one word, meaning balance, fracture into two orders that would spend 25,000 years trying to exterminate each other? The easy answer, the one you'll find across half the internet, is that they simply disagreed. Light lovers and dark lovers fell out, drew their swords, and philosophy curdled into war. That answer is the shape of a much better truth, with all the interesting parts sanded off. The real reason the Jedi broke has almost nothing to do with a debate about good and evil, and almost everything to do with a fleet of alien slavers who came out of the sky and forced a peaceful order to make a choice no one should have to make. What they chose kept them alive, and it damned everything that came after. But we can't understand that choice until we understand the ground they were standing on. Because this wasn't just any planet, this was a world that would shake itself apart if its people lost their balance, and it was watching them the entire time. Imagine the ground moving, not a tremor, a heave, like the planet under you just inhaled. The sky, clear an hour ago, is now the color of a bruise, and lightning is walking across the horizon in slow, deliberate steps. Somewhere in a stone temple, a young Force user has let their anger run too hot, or sunk too deep into serene detachment, and the world has noticed. This is Tython, and Tython does not forgive imbalance. That single fact makes everything else on this planet make sense. In the Dawn of the Jedi comics, Tython is not a passive stage where the story happens, it's a participant. When the Force falls out of balance, when too many of its people lean too far into the light or the dark, the planet answers with storms, with earthquakes, with what the comics call force storms that can level cities. The land itself keeps score, live in harmony, and Tython is hospitable, almost gentle. Tip the scales and it turns on you like a wounded animal. Now think about what that does to a religion. Everywhere else in the galaxy, morality is an argument. You can debate whether an act was right, whether the ends justified the means, whether a little darkness in a good cause is forgivable. On Tython, there's no debate because the planet settles it for you. Balance isn't a virtue you aspire to, it's a survival requirement enforced by the ground under your feet. You don't stay centered because it's noble, you stay centered because the alternative is your home tearing itself to pieces around you. Where did these people even come from? Not from Tython, that's the strange part. According to Force Storm, the first issue of the series, they were brought here. 8 enormous pyramid ships called the Tho Yor woke across the galaxy galaxy, each buried on a different world, and called out to the Force-sensitive beings around them. Humans, Wookiees, Twi'leks, Selkath, the red-skinned Sith species, and more. Pilgrims of a dozen kinds, none of whom had asked for this, felt the pull, boarded the ships, and were carried to a single planet in the deep core, roughly 36,000 years before the events of the first film. They didn't choose Tython. Something chose it for them, gathered them there, and left them to figure out why. What they figured out was the Force. And Tython, with its violent reaction to any imbalance, was the harshest possible teacher. You learn fast when the lessons come with earthquakes. Over generations, these scattered pilgrims became something coherent, an order of warrior scholars who took their name from that old word, Jedi, the mystic center. Warriors because a dangerous world demands them. Scholars because they were trying to understand a power that could shatter continents. And centered, always centered, because Tython would accept nothing else. Picture the daily reality of that. Every emotion carries a cost. Grief that pulls you toward the dark, joy that lifts you too far into the light. Both dangerous, not metaphorically, but geologically. The Jedi walked a line the later Jedi would have called impossible, because the later Jedi decided one side of it was simply forbidden. The Jedi had no such luxury. They had to hold both. And holding both, it turns out, is exhausting. People slip. A master loses a child and grief drags them down. A student touches real power for the first time and the light becomes intoxicating. And on Tython, it can't be allowed to keep happening because one person's imbalance can crack the sky for everyone. So the Jedi built a system to catch the ones who fell too far in either direction and drag them back to center. It is one of the strangest disciplinary systems in all of Star Wars. And if I described it to you cold, you'd assume I had the light and the dark reversed. A Jedi who fell too far toward the dark side, cold, hungry, cruel with power, was sent somewhere to bathe in light until they recovered. So far, so sensible. But reverse it. A Jedi who fell too far toward the light, detached, rigid, lost in serene certainty, was sent into the dark, on purpose, as a cure. That inverts everything the modern Jedi ever taught you about which direction is the cliff. The Jedi had 2 moons over Tython, and they'd named them long ago. The bright one was Ashla, the light. The dark one was Bogan. And these weren't just poetic labels, they were the actual words the Jedi used for the 2 aspects of the Force itself. Ashla meant the light side, Bogan meant the dark. The whole cosmology hung right there in the night sky. One pale moon and one shadowed one. A permanent reminder that you were meant to hold both. So when someone lost their balance, the Order used those moons. A Jedi who strayed too deep into the dark was exiled to Bogan, the Dark Moon, where, stripped of distraction, they meditated on the distant light of Ashla until balance returned. One who fell too far into the light was sent the other way, to Ashla, to sit with the dark face of Bogan. You were always sent toward what you lacked. Think about what that reveals. To the modern Jedi, the dark side is a one-way door. You touch it and you're falling, and the only safe amount is none. But the Jedi treated an excess of light as exactly as dangerous. A Jedi who had scrubbed all shadow from themselves wasn't a saint in their eyes. They were a patient, someone who'd lost the plot as badly as any power-hungry apprentice, just in the opposite direction, and who needed the same correction. A long, lonely meditation on the thing they'd been running from. There's a line from the comics that captures the whole philosophy, spoken like scripture. In the light there is a darkness, and in the darkness a light. Be a prisoner of neither Bogan nor Ashla, but strive to live in balance. Be a prisoner of neither. Not flee the dark, not cling to the light, neither. The light defined the dark the way the dark defined the light, and a person who belonged wholly to one had, in a real sense, stopped being whole. And it worked. That's the part that's easy to skip past. This wasn't a fragile idea that collapsed on contact with reality. The system of the 2 moons, the philosophy of the mystic center, the whole delicate machinery of balance, it held for thousands of years. Generations of Force users lived and died inside it, correcting each other, exiling and recalling, keeping Tython calm and the sky unbroken. Whatever else you want to say about the Jedi, they weren't naive. They had built something that lasted, which is exactly what makes what comes next so devastating, because a system that survives for millennia doesn't usually die from within. It dies when something arrives from outside that it was never designed to handle, something the 2 moons had no answer for, something no meditation could correct. And something did arrive. It fell out of the sky in a burning ship, the sole survivor of a crash, carrying a weapon no Jedi could touch and a way of using the Force none of them had ever seen. He didn't believe in balance. He'd never heard the word. To him, the dark side wasn't a moon you were exiled to when you strayed. It was simply where he lived, the only home he had ever known. He'd never once been told to find balance because the people who raised him would have laughed at the idea. They didn't want him balanced. They wanted him sharp. His name was Zesh, and he was something the Jedi had no category for. A person built deliberately into a weapon of the dark side. To understand him, you have to understand what made him. Far from Tython, spread across the galaxy like a stain, was the infinite empire of the Rakata, and we'll get to the full horror of them soon enough. What matters now is one thing they did. The Rakata used the Force the way they used everything, as a tool for conquest. To find the worlds worth conquering, they created Force Hounds. Force-sensitive slaves, trained from the ground up in the dark side, whose entire purpose was to be pointed at the galaxy and made to sniff out planets rich in the Force. Zesh was one of these, a living instrument for locating power so his masters could come and take it. And that's the whole engine of his character. Zesh didn't fall to the dark side. He was never anywhere else. He had no memory of a self before the darkness, no philosophy telling him it was a temptation to resist, no moon to be exiled to. Where the Jedi spent their lives holding the dark at arm's length, terrified of tipping too far, Zesh had been submerged in it since before he could form the thought that there was anything else. The dark side wasn't his sin, it was his mother tongue. And it was Zesh who found Tython. In the service of his Rakatan master, hunting for a Force-strong world in the deep core, he was drawn toward the very planet the Jedi called home, a beacon of the Force so bright it could not stay hidden forever. His ship, the Devourer, came apart. It crashed, and when the Jedi went to the wreck, they found exactly one survivor pulled from the fire, a dark side warrior who spoke a language of power they had spent their whole civilization learning to fear. Watch what happens to them in that moment, because it's beautifully human. The Jedi encounter, for the first time, a person who is pure dark side, not a fallen brother to be corrected, not a student who slipped, but someone for whom their entire disciplinary system is meaningless. You cannot exile Xesh to Bogan to meditate on the light, because darkness isn't an imbalance in him to be fixed. It's the foundation he's built on. Their moons, their meditations, their thousands of years of hard-won technique, none of it has a slot for what just walked out of the wreckage. They try anyway, that's the poignant part. When Zesh's darkness proves too much, the Jedi Council does the only thing their tradition knows how to do. They exile him to Bogan to find balance, as if he were one of their own who'd lost his way, as if the cure that had worked for 10,000 years would work on a man who had no center to return to, because he'd never had one to begin with. But Zesh didn't come empty-handed. He brought something out of that crash, a device, a weapon, unlike anything the Jedi had ever held. Their own arms were metal swords, augmented through the Force, honorable and ancient and limited. What Zesh carried was something else entirely, a blade of pure energy, the ancestor of every lightsaber that would ever ignite in this galaxy for the next 25,000 years. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. When the Jedi picked it up, it wouldn't work for them. The most sacred weapon in the history of the Jedi Order, the thing that would come to mean everything they stood for, was born as a weapon of the enemy. And at first, the only person who could make it burn was the servant of the dark. The lightsaber is a lie about its own origins, not a malicious one, just the kind of story that gets tidied up over 25,000 years until nobody remembers the blood on it. We think of that blade as the very symbol of the Jedi, elegant, disciplined, the weapon of a guardian, but the first version of it on Tython was none of those things. It was a force saber. It came off the body of a darkside slave, and it ran on darkness the way a fire runs on fuel. Here's what made it so unsettling. Their swords were physical, metal, forged, then channeled through the Force in a warrior's hands. Skill lived in the wielder. But Zesh's Force Saber wasn't like that. The blade itself was made of the Force, and specifically of the dark side. To ignite it, you had to reach into the dark and pour yourself through it. It wasn't a tool you picked up and pointed. It was a demand. It required your anger, your hunger, your pain, and gave you devastating power in exchange. Which is why, when the Jedi first tried to use it, they couldn't. Here are the greatest Force users of their age, masters of a discipline thousands of years deep, and they take hold of this glowing blade and nothing. It stays dead in their hands because they were balanced, and the weapon didn't want balance. It wanted a wielder willing to fall. For a while, the only being on the planet who could make it burn was Zesh himself, and then someone else did. In the comics, it's the young Jedi Shea Koda. During the chaos Zesh brings the Tython, one of her masters appears to die, and in a flash of raw grief and fury, Shay grabs the Force Saber and it ignites. For her, this time, not for Zesh. And she turns it on him to take her revenge. Look at the mechanism of that scene, because it's the whole warning of the weapon in miniature. She didn't unlock it through study. She unlocked it through rage. The blade came alive the instant she stopped being balanced and let the dark side take her, if only for a moment. The Force Saber didn't make her powerful. It made her fall, and being powerful was the reward for falling. That is the seed of everything. A weapon has arrived that offers overwhelming power to anyone willing to reach into the dark side to use it. On a normal world, that might be a curiosity, a dangerous artifact to be locked away. But remember where we are. We're on Tython, a planet that punishes imbalance with earthquakes, home to an order that has organized its entire existence around never falling too far in either direction. Introduce into a culture built on restraint, a tool that rewards the exact thing they've spent millennia teaching each other not to do. What could possibly hold? The honest answer is, restraint could hold, as long as there was no reason to abandon it. A dangerous weapon you don't have to use isn't a crisis, it's a temptation you can refuse. The Jedi could look at that blade, understand what it demanded, and choose to leave it be. But the whole tragedy of the Jedi is that they were about to lose the luxury of refusal, because the Force Saber wasn't the threat, it was the sample. A single scout's weapon dropped by accident on their doorstep, a preview of what was coming. Zesh had been sent to find Tython, he'd found it. And the empire that made him, the empire that turned children into hounds and pointed them at the galaxy's treasures, does not send a scout and then forget the address. They were coming. Not one slave with one blade. A fleet, an ideology, a machine of conquest that had already swallowed world after world. And against that, balance alone was not going to be enough. Long before the Empire you know, before the Death Star, before Palpatine, before a single stormtrooper marched, there was an empire so vast and so cruel that its name survived across 25,000 years as a kind of galactic ghost story. And it isn't just a Legends invention you can wave away. In the modern canon, in the first season of Andor, Luthen Rael name drops these same monsters as ancient enslavers who once terrorized the galaxy. The empire the Jedi faced is real enough that Star Wars still whispers about it today. They were the Rakata, and their domain was called the Infinite Empire. The name was not modesty. At their height, they had conquered worlds beyond counting, and they had done it with a combination that has never stopped being terrifying. Advanced technology on one hand, and mastery of the dark side of the Force on the other. Most conquerors have armies. The Rakata had armies and sorcery, machines and force hounds, hyperdrives and slave collars. A civilization that had turned the Force itself into infrastructure for domination. You already met one product of that infrastructure. Zesh, the force hound, wasn't an anomaly, he was a category. The Rakata bred force-sensitive slaves specifically to range across the galaxy and locate worlds strong in the Force, so the Empire could arrive and strip them. Where the Jedi treated the Force as something to be understood, balanced, respected, the Rakata treated it as a resource, a vein of ore to be mined. It's the difference between a monastery and a mining company that's just discovered the monastery is sitting on gold. And through Zesh, the mining company had found the address. Tython, a planet so saturated with the Force it had been hidden in the deep core. One of the hardest regions of the galaxy to navigate was now a marked target. To the Infinite Empire, the Jedi weren't warriors to be respected. They were livestock guarding a treasure. So the invasion came the way these things always come. Not all at once, but world by world, a tightening ring. The Rakata rolled through the surrounding system, taking the settled worlds one after another, and each fallen planet was both a conquest and a message. This is what happens, and you are next. For an order that had spent its whole history managing its own inner equilibrium, the danger this time wasn't a brother who'd strayed toward Bogan. It was an entire empire, indifferent to your philosophy, that simply wanted to eat you. Now put yourself in the council chamber. You are a Jedi Master. Your civilization is built on a single principle. Never fall too far into the dark, because the dark unbalanced is ruin, and your own planet will punish you for it. And bearing down on you is a foe with the numbers, the technology, and the dark side power to erase everything you've built. Your metal swords and your careful meditations are not going to stop them. You have seen, with your own eyes, one weapon that could, the Force Saber. The blade that runs on darkness, the thing that came off the enemy's own Force Hound. You know exactly what using it will cost. You've watched Shaykota grab it in a moment of rage and feel the dark side surge through her. You know that to arm yourselves this way is to walk straight into the one place your entire tradition forbids. And you know that if you don't, you may simply die, and everything the Jedi ever were dies with you. That is the choice. Not a philosophical debate in some quiet seminar. A cornered people, an existential threat, and a terrible pragmatic question. How much of your soul will you spend to survive? And to lead them into the answer, they would reach back into their own recent history and free a man they had locked away for going mad. Because it turned out he hadn't been mad. He'd been early. Fury's Gate, Obri, Mar, Skagora. Say them like a countdown, because that's what they were. The settled worlds of the Tython system, falling one after another as the Infinite Empire closed in. Each name on that list was a place with people in it, and each one going dark on the map meant the ring was tightening toward the one that mattered. Home. When the Rakata finally struck Tython itself, the Jedi managed something the Outer Worlds hadn't. They held. They repelled the first assault, but holding is not winning.
The Empire fell back, seized the forest world of Skagora, and dug in, establishing a command post from which to grind the Jedi down. This was not a raid to be weathered and forgotten. It was a siege of an entire star system, and the defenders were badly, structurally outmatched. So they did what desperate people do. They changed. The Jedi allied themselves with the forces of the settled worlds, the very non-Force sensitives whose ancestors had once left Tython, some of whom had come to resent the Order. Old grievances got set aside, because the alternative was extinction. Command of the joint forces went to a Jedi Master named Rajivari, and I want you to hold that name. Rajivari, General of the Allied Army, one of the most respected figures of the age. What he becomes later is the hinge the whole story swings on. And then they crossed the line. This is the moment the entire tradition had been built to prevent, and they walked across it with open eyes. With Zesh's knowledge, the former Force Hound now among them, the Jedi built Force Sabers of their own. Not one experimental blade grabbed in a moment of grief, but weapons, plural, issued to their warriors. They took the tool that ran on darkness, the thing they knew required a wielder willing to fall, and they made it standard. According to the records of the invasion, the Force Sabers forced the Jedi to draw upon the dark side, and it was only because of those weapons that they survived at all. Feel the weight of that trade. Every time a Jedi ignited one of those blades, they were reaching into Bogan. Every strike was a small fall. A tradition that had spent thousands of years exiling people to a moon for touching too much darkness was now handing that darkness out as a survival kit, because balance doesn't stop a Rakatan war fleet, and a blade of pure dark side does. They didn't abandon their principles out of corruption or greed. They abandoned them out of love. Love for the people they were trying to save, and the cold arithmetic that said the alternative was to die pure and let everyone die with them. There's a name for the kind of story where good people, cornered, choose the dark thing for the best of reasons and are ruined by it anyway. It's called tragedy, and the Jedi were writing one in real time, though none of them could see the shape of it yet, because they were still winning, and winning has a way of hiding the cost. But arming themselves wasn't the last desperate measure. There was one more, and it was the strangest of all. Years earlier, a Jedi had suffered a vision so terrible it drove him insane. A prophecy of dark warriors and fire and a one-eyed figure leading an army of shadow. They'd declared him mad, exiled him to Bogan, and left him there for 7 long years to rot in his own delusions. Now the invasion had arrived, and it looked exactly like what he'd seen. So the Jedi went to the Dark Moon, opened the exile cell, and put a general's authority in the hands of the man they'd locked away for losing his mind, because he was the only one who had known this was coming. An army of dark warriors, wielding blades of frozen fire, marching across the world, led by a being with a single red eye. That was the vision, and the man who saw it wasn't rewarded for his foresight. His name was Daegen Lok, and the cruelest thing about his story is that he was right the entire time. Lok had gone somewhere no Jedi was supposed to go. Beneath one of the temples was a place called the Chasm, and Lok descended into it, against all conventional wisdom, against the accumulated caution of his whole order. And down there in the dark, the Force showed him something specific and detailed. Warriors carrying blades of energy that burned like frozen fire, an army of shadow sweeping across the land, and at its head a figure with one red eye. And in the vision, Lok saw himself rising to lead the Jedi against exactly that threat. The Council looked at a man raving about energy blades and one-eyed conquerors and a war that hadn't happened, and they did the balanced thing.
They diagnosed him as fallen, tipped too far toward the dark by whatever he touched in the chasm, and applied the ancient cure. Exile to Bogan, meditate on the light, renounce the vision, return to balance, and you may come home. So Daegen Lok went to the Dark Moon and stayed there 7 years, and in his solitude carved an enormous mural of himself wielding the blade of fire. Over and over, a madman drawing the same delusion into the stone. Except every piece of it was about to come true. Blades of frozen fire, the Force Sabers, now igniting in Jedi hands across the war. An army of dark warriors, the Rakatan host, sweeping through the system. He hadn't been mad.
He'd been a prophet, and his order had punished him for it, because their whole framework had no way to tell the difference between a man who'd lost his balance and a man who'd seemed too far into the dark to look calm about it. So the Jedi, desperate, went back to Bogan, freed the prophet they'd imprisoned, and made him a general. The very role he'd seen himself playing in the vision they'd called insanity. His curse became his qualification. And notice what's quietly happening to the Jedi in these decisions, because it's the real story underneath the battles. First they armed themselves with dark side weapons. Now they've put a dark-touched visionary at the head of their armies. Step by step, choice by reasonable choice, the Mystic Center is drifting. Not out of villainy, every single move makes sense in the moment, every one justified by the emergency. That's how it always works. Nobody decides to fall. They just keep making the sensible call, one crisis at a time, until they look up and don't recognize where they're standing. Lok would lead, he'd fight and win victories and give speeches to the surviving Jedi about the necessity of what they were doing. And here is the turn that makes this chapter more than a war story. Daegen Lok's victories are not going to save the Jedi Order. They're going to end it. Because the greatest danger the Jedi ever faced was never the Rakata at all. It was what winning would do to them. Let me argue the other side for a moment. What if the darkness saved them? Strip away everything you think you know about the dark side being a poison. Look at the raw facts of this war, and a genuinely uncomfortable case appears. Without the fall, Tython dies. Balance, the pure, disciplined, meditate on the opposite moon balance the Jedi had practiced for millennia, did not stop the Infinite Empire. What repelled it was the Force Saber, the blade that ran on darkness, wielded by Jedi willing to fall far enough to make it burn. Every world they held with the dark side in their hands. If they had clung to their principles and refused the weapon, the likeliest outcome is not a noble martyrdom remembered for ages. It's a silent, total erasure, an order slaughtered, a planet enslaved, and no Jedi at all, ever, anywhere. Maybe the dark side here was not the villain. Maybe it was the medicine. There's even a philosophical upgrade buried in the horror of it. One of the sharper observations about this war is that during the fighting, the Jedi began to move away from their old crutch, the moons themselves. For thousands of years, balance had been something you managed externally. Fall too far, get shipped to Ashla or Bogan, meditate, come back. Discipline imposed from outside, enforced by exile. But you cannot exile a soldier in the middle of a war. Combat taught the Jedi, brutally, that balance couldn't be a place you got sent to. It had to be something you carried inside yourself, moment to moment, even with the dark side blade in your fist. In a strange way, the war forced a maturity on them that the comfortable millennia never had. So there's the case for the defense. The dark side kept them alive, and the war made their understanding of balance deeper and more real. If the story ended there, you could almost call it a hard-won triumph, a wise old order tempered by fire into something tougher and truer. But watch the crack running through even the victories. Not everyone was buying it. As Daegen Lok delivered his speeches about the necessity of what they'd become, at least one Jedi turned and walked away in disgust. The young Seknos Wrath, who could not stomach how comfortably the Order was wearing the dark side now, how easily we have to, was sliding into we like to. He felt it first, the way triumph was starting to taste like appetite. Because here's what the case for the defense conveniently leaves out. The medicine that saves a dying patient doesn't always agree to leave once the patient recovers. You reach into the dark side to survive a war, and it works, and the war ends, and then you're standing there, alive, victorious, still holding the thing that made you win, and it's asking you a question the philosophers never prepared you for. Why would you put me down? And then the Rakata broke. The empire that had swallowed the system was beaten and sent fleeing. Every instinct tells you that's the happy ending. Invaders repelled, planet saved, war over. And it is the end of the war. It is not the end of the fighting. Everyone assumes the invasion split the Jedi. Outside pressure cracks the order. The enemy at the gates does the breaking. It's clean, and it's wrong, and the timing is what changes everything. While the Rakatan threat was defeated, the Jedi split into two. Not because they were losing, not in the chaos of invasion. After. They held, they allied, they armed, they fought, and a monastic order of philosophers beat back a galactic empire. The threat was gone, and that is precisely when they came apart. So if it wasn't the enemy, what was it? It was the weapon they couldn't set down. Not the physical Force Saber, but the thing the Force Saber had taught them. For the length of the war, the dark side had been a tool, justified by necessity, pointed at an outside foe. But you cannot marinate a whole order in the dark side for years, feed it power in exchange for pain, teach it that falling wins battles, and then expect everyone to simply exhale and go back to serene balance the moment the shooting stops. Some could, some couldn't, and the ones who couldn't didn't experience it as corruption. They experienced it as truth, a revelation that the old balance had been a lie, that the dark side wasn't a danger to be managed, but the real source of strength, the thing that had actually saved them, while all that talk of centeredness had done nothing. That's how the Order divided, and notice it wasn't good people versus bad people. It was two honest readings of the same war. One faction looked back and said, the dark side was a terrible necessity, a debt we took on to survive, and now we repay it and return to the light. Never again. They held to Ashla, and to a hardening conviction that the darkness they'd touched was a poison to be purged forever. The other faction looked at the identical events and drew the opposite lesson. The dark gave us victory when the light gave us nothing, and only a fool hands back the power that kept him alive. They held to Bogan, and weren't willing to pretend otherwise. And here's the quiet devastation of it. These weren't invaders and defenders now. They were brothers. Former allies who had bled side by side against the Empire, stood on the same walls and buried the same dead, now looking across a widening gap and seeing not a comrade, but a heretic. The most vicious wars are never between strangers. They're between people who used to be one thing and can't forgive each other for no longer being it. The balance held 10,000 years against every internal temptation. What it could not survive was victory. The poisonous aftertaste of having won by doing the one thing you swore never to do and being unable to agree afterward on what that meant. And leading the faction that could not let go of the dark, standing at the head of the fall, was a name you were told to remember. Not some outsider, not Zesh, the alien force hound who started all of this. The man who would become, in every way that matters, the first Sith the galaxy ever produced, was one of the founding fathers of the Jedi Order itself. Picture the Temple of Calith from the outside, and the man standing at its gate with a darkside blade lit in his hand, ready to bring down the very order he helped build. This is not a Rakatan. This is not some corrupted stranger. This is Rajivari, General of the War, one of the 4 founders of the Jedi Order, a name spoken with reverence, and he has turned that blade against his own creation. If you want the exact moment the Jedi and the Sith are born as enemies, it isn't a battle between two peoples. It's one man betraying himself. Watch how it happens because the sequence is almost unbearable. When the dust of the Force Wars began to settle, the followers of Ashla did the noble thing. Led by 4 masters, they founded a new order and wrote it a soul. They would use their power only to protect the weak and the disenfranchised. That's the Jedi Order. That's the origin of the vow you've heard echoed for 40 years, guardians of peace and justice. And the 4 names on that founding charter were Garen Jard, Calla Bryn, Tur Sinden, and Rajivari. The general, the war hero, a father of the Jedi. And then Rajivari broke from them. The very man who had helped write the promise to protect the weak became the first to abandon it, splintering away to form a dissident group of Darksiders, seizing the Temple of Calith and turning to make war on the order he had just founded. His followers holed up inside those walls and fought to the death and were defeated, but the wound was already permanent. The first person to fall from the Jedi wasn't a student who strayed. It was one of the architects. The betrayal was built into the foundation from the first day. Why does the man who writes the vow become the first to break it? The comics don't hand you a tidy villain's monologue, and that's a mercy, because the real answer is more disturbing than any monologue. Rajivari had been the general. He had led the war effort personally, which means he, more than almost anyone, had lived inside the dark side as a daily instrument. He had reached into Bogan again and again and watched it work. Watched it win where light and balance had failed. For a man like that, the Lightsiders' resolution to purge the darkness and never touch it again couldn't have looked like wisdom. It would have looked like ingratitude, like fools trying to bury the very thing that had saved them, out of squeamishness, out of denial. That's the terrible plausibility of it. Rajivari didn't fall because he was weak or wicked. He fell because he'd learned a lesson the war had genuinely taught, that the dark side was powerful, that it was effective, that it had kept them all alive. And he refused to unlearn it just because the danger had passed, and his old friends had gotten nervous. From inside his own head, he wasn't a traitor. He was the only one still honest about what they'd all done together. And that is the exact psychology that will produce every Sith who ever lives. Not cartoon evil. This, the conviction that the dark side is simply real, simply strong, and that those who preach against it are cowards or hypocrites, refusing to grasp what power actually is. Palpatine believes it. Vader is seduced by it. Every fallen Jedi across 25,000 years walks some version of Rajivari's road. They lied to you about your own strength, and I will tell you the truth. The founding hero of the Jedi Order invented the argument that would end 1,000 of his successors. But even Rajivari's betrayal isn't quite the deepest layer, because you could still tell yourself a story where the dark side was a contamination, something brought in from outside, from the Force Sabers, from Zesh, from the Rakata, something foreign that infected a pure order. That story is comforting. It's also false. The darkness that split the Jedi wasn't carried in on an enemy's blade. It had been sitting inside the Order, in plain sight, walking its halls in a familiar red-skinned form, from the very beginning. Here's the detail almost nobody knows. The Sith, the red-skinned species whose name would become a synonym for evil across the galaxy, were not enemies who invaded the Jedi from outside. They were members. Among the pilgrims the Thoyor gathered on Tython, red-skinned Sith served as Jedi alongside humans and Twi'leks and Wookiees, long before Sith meant anything but a face in the crowd. And that detonates the immune system theory of the dark side. It would be so reassuring to say the darkness came in from outside, that Zesh carried it, that the Rakata infected a healthy order, and if only that infection had never arrived, the Jedi would have stayed pure forever. But the Sith species inside the Order from the start tells you the opposite. The capacity for the fall wasn't imported. It was already there, in the ranks, part of the family. The darkness that would eventually take the Sith name wasn't a virus, it was a sibling. That reframes everything. The split of the Jedi wasn't a pure body catching a disease. It was a house with a fault line running through its foundation from the day it was built, finally coming apart under stress. The war didn't create the division, it revealed it. The dark side didn't invade the Order. It was always one of the two moons the Order lived beneath, always half of what they were. When the Jedi looked up at Ashla and Bogan every night and called them two aspects of a single whole, they were telling the literal truth about themselves. The whole contained both. It always had. And a whole that contains both can always, under enough pressure, choose to become only one. So when the red-skinned Sith among them gave themselves fully to Bogan, they weren't betraying the Jedi from without. They were one part of the Jedi soul tearing free from the other. The Jedi and the Sith weren't two enemies who met on a battlefield. They were one being, splitting down the seam that had run through it since the beginning, each half convinced it was the true inheritor and the other half the corruption. And the fighting this produced was not a skirmish, this was the Force Wars, a series of conflicts that raged, by the records, for roughly a decade. 10 years of former brothers hunting each other across a single planet. Light against dark, Ashla against Bogan, each side using the very weapons the war against the Rakata had taught them to wield. There was no outside enemy anymore to give it meaning, just an order devouring itself year after year over the question of what the darkness they'd all touched had really meant. 10 years of that does something to a world, especially a world like Tython, a planet that had always answered imbalance with storms and quakes, that had spent 36,000 years punishing its people for tipping too far in either direction. Now imagine that planet subjected not to one person's slip toward the dark, but to a decade of total, catastrophic imbalance. An entire civilization at war with itself across the surface. The Force screaming out of true everywhere at once. A world that trembled when a single Jedi lost their center was now hosting a 10-year civil war between light and dark. Tython had always kept the score. It was about to settle it. 25,783 BBY. That's the year the planet died. Not conquered, not evacuated. Died as a living world. A decade of war between light and dark had torn Tython's balance so completely that a cataclysm swept the planet and destroyed its biosphere, rendering the birthplace of the Jedi uninhabitable. The world that had cradled Force users for 36,000 years was left a ruined waste, and the people who had done it to themselves stood in the ashes of the only home their tradition had ever known. There's a grim symmetry the story doesn't need to spell out, but you should let yourself feel. Tython had always punished imbalance. For 36,000 years, the Jedi had lived in careful terror of tipping too far, because they knew what the world would do, and then they tipped as far as it is possible to tip. 10 years of open war, an entire civilization torn between the two moons at once. The planet did exactly what it had always done. It answered imbalance. It just answered a catastrophe on the scale of a catastrophe. The Jedi had spent their history being warned in earthquakes, and at the end they earned the full and final reply. The Lightsiders won. That's the outcome, if you can call it winning. Rajivari's Darkside faction had seized Kalith, fought to the death, and been defeated. The followers of Ashla held the field. But the field was a corpse. What the victorious Jedi inherited was a dead planet and a shattered order. And they did the only thing left. They left. The surviving Ashla Jedi fled Tython out toward the Galactic Rim and eventually found a new home on the world of Ossus, where the Jedi Order as history would come to know it truly took root, and in time joined the young Galactic Republic as Guardians of the Peace. But look at what they carried with them and what they left behind. They left Tython so thoroughly that the Young Republic would ban travel there and the world would fade into myth, a name most Jedi millennia later wouldn't even recognize. And they carried a lesson learned at the worst possible angle. They had watched the dark side split their order, kill their planet, and produce the first fallen brother in their history. Is it any wonder the Jedi who walked away from that graveyard drew a hard line? That they hardened over generations into an order that no longer spoke of balancing the dark, but of rejecting it, absolutely, as the one road to ruin. You can see the whole future Jedi Order being forged in that trauma, the rigidity, the fear of attachment, of passion, of anything that might tip a Jedi toward Bogan, the insistence that the dark side is a poison with no safe dose. It comes from here, from the memory, however dimmed by time, of what happened the last time Force users tried to hold both light and dark at once and let the balance slip. The Jedi died of the dark side. Their heirs decided the only safe amount was none. And that decision, reasonable, understandable, born of real grief, is the quiet catastrophe underneath all the noise. Because in fleeing the dark so completely, the Jedi didn't escape it, they just amputated half of themselves and called the wound wisdom. They forgot the two moons. They forgot that the whole had always contained both. They became, over 10,000 years, exactly the kind of Force users a Jedi would have exiled to Bogan for their own good. Prisoners of the light, so far to one side they couldn't see the imbalance in themselves. They tried to bury all of it. The war, the planet, the founder who fell, the red-skinned brothers who became the enemy. And for a very long time, it stayed buried, a piece of legends almost no one read, a dead world in the deep core. But the strange thing about this story is that it refuses to stay dead. In the last few years, quietly, the modern canon has started digging one artifact after another back out of the ground. In 2021, in a Star Wars novel set thousands of years before the movies, a Jedi Master named Elzar Mann goes off alone to meditate, and the place he chooses is a moon called Ashla. If you didn't know the buried history, that name means nothing. If you do, it should stop you cold, because that is the light moon of Tython, the bright half of the two that hung over the Jedi, quietly slipped back into canon by author Cavan Scott in The Rising Storm, as if the modern galaxy were remembering something it had spent 36,000 years forgetting. Now be careful here, because this is where honesty matters more than a good story. The full saga of the Jedi, the Force Wars, the Rakatan invasion, Rajivari's betrayal, all of it remains legends. It is not, as of now, official modern canon. When the timelines were reset in 2014, the whole dawn of the Jedi era became an alternate history, a wellspring of ideas rather than established fact. The canon Jedi Order wasn't even founded on Tython. That honor went to Ahch-To, the planet where an exiled Luke Skywalker would one day teach Rey. So I'm not going to tell you the story you just heard is what really happened in the current continuity. It isn't. It's legends. That's the truth, and it doesn't need inflating. But watch what canon is doing anyway, piece by careful piece. The moon Ashla, back. The Rakatan and their Infinite Empire, named aloud in Andor of all places, when Luthen Rael invokes them as ancient monsters who once enslaved the galaxy. The Infinite Empire also turns up in a canon sourcebook. And Tython itself, the dead homeworld, has appeared in the modern era, glimpsed in The Mandalorian, still orbited by two moons, one of them still named Ashla. None of these on its own proves anything. Together, they look less like coincidence and more like a slow, deliberate exhumation. Lucasfilm keeps reaching into that legend's grave and lifting out one bone at a time. And there's a reason the timing feels charged right now. A Dawn of the Jedi film has been announced, with James Mangold attached to direct. A movie set in that same primordial era, exploring the origin of the Jedi in canon for the first time.
Nobody outside the production knows yet how much of the Jedi story it will use or invent or discard. It may adapt the comics closely, it may throw them out and build something wholly new. That's genuinely unknown, and I won't pretend otherwise.
But the fact that Lucasfilm has spent the last few years quietly restoring Ashla, the Rakata, and Tython to canon, right as it prepares to tell an origin story on screen, is not the behavior of a studio that's finished with these ideas. It looks like a studio laying track. So here's where that leaves us, honestly. Everything you've heard tonight, the two moons, the planet that punished imbalance, the exile of Daegen Lok, the Force Saber that ran on darkness, the founder who became the first fallen, the red-skinned brothers who became the enemy, the 10-year war that killed a world, lives in legends. Treat it as the rich, tragic, largely forgotten mythology it is. But don't file it away as irrelevant, because canon has been reaching back for it, and the screen may be about to reach further. The line between old story nobody reads and the thing everyone's about to be talking about is thinner right now than it's been in years. Which brings us finally to the only question that actually matters. The one this whole excavation was for. Not what happened on Tython, we've traced that. The real question is what it means that we ever believe something simpler, and what the Jedi understood that their heirs, and we, spent the next 25,000 years trying to forget. There's a mural on Ahch-To. When Luke Skywalker shows Rey the first Jedi temple in The Last Jedi, the camera lingers on an ancient carving of the Prime Jedi, the mythic first of the Order sitting in meditation, and rendered right into the stone is a circle, half light and half dark, the two held in perfect equilibrium. Luke tries to explain it to Rey. The Force isn't the light side's property. Light and dark, warmth and cold, life and death. It's the balance between them. And if you've followed this whole story, that image should hit you like recognition, because you've seen it before. 36,000 years earlier, on a different planet under two moons, an order that called itself the Mystic Center believed exactly the same thing. The end of the Jedi story and its beginning are looking at the same picture. That's the circle closing, and it's a bitter one. The Jedi understood from the first that the whole contained both, two moons in one sky, and that a person or an order belonging entirely to either had lost its balance and become something to be corrected. Then came the war, and the fall, and the death of Tython, and their heirs drew the opposite conclusion. They looked at what the dark side had done and decided the answer was to reject it utterly, to build 10,000 years of doctrine on the idea that a single step toward Bogan was a step toward damnation. They thought they were fleeing the mistake that killed Tython. They were making a new one in the opposite direction, and it took them millennia to even glimpse it. Because here's the cruelest irony in the whole saga, and it's the note I want to leave you on. The Jedi's obsessive purity, their fear of the dark, their refusal of attachment and passion, their insistence on one moon only, didn't prevent the Sith. It produced them. Every fallen Jedi across galactic history walks Rajivari's road. The discovery that the dark side is real and powerful, followed by rage at an order that lied to them about it, that told them their own strength was forbidden. An order that had held both, the way the Jedi tried to, would have had far less to offer a tempter. It was the Jedi's own amputation of the dark that left a raw, unhealed edge, and the Sith are what grew there, again and again, for 25,000 years. The light, taken to an extreme, defined its own shadow. The Jedi could have told them that. It's written in the very cosmology they abandoned. The light defines the dark, as the dark defines the light. So when you strip it all the way down, the Great War of Star Wars, Jedi and Sith, Order and Chaos, the story we've been told is good against evil, was never really two things fighting. It was one thing that forgot it was one thing. A single order under two moons that couldn't survive its own victory and tore itself down the seam that had always run through it. Every lightsaber duel across every era is, in a sense, the Jedi still arguing with themselves. Light side and dark side. Both of them right, both of them wrong. Neither one whole without the other, and neither able to remember that they used to share a name. Say it one more time. Jedi. Jedi. Your mouth barely moves. We started with a translation error, a single word that fractured into two, and I told you the split wasn't good against evil. It was one thing becoming two. Now you know what the two moons were, and what it cost to forget them, and why the Mystic Center could never quite hold. The Jedi spent 25,000 years insisting the dark side was the enemy, but the enemy was never the dark, it was the forgetting. The moment a people who once held both looked up at two moons in one sky and decided they only needed one.